What happens when a woman is publicly shamed for a disability no one can see? Dr. Serafina Washington, a brilliant scientist on her way to accept a prestigious award, was about to find out. On a crowded flight, a senior crew member looked her in the eye and called her a liar, accusing her of faking her condition to get special treatment. In front of hundreds of strangers, she was humiliated, her pain dismissed as a performance. But what the crew of Ascend Air didn't know was that the very man who owned their airline, the man who signed their paychecks, was on speed dial, and he was Serafina's husband. This isn't just a story of mistaken identity. It's a story of brutal karma and a reckoning that would shake an entire corporation to its core. Dr. Serafina Washington moved through the world with a grace that belied the constant grinding war being waged within her own body. To the casual observer, she was the picture of success, a statuesque black woman in her late 30s, with intelligent eyes that held a universe of thought and a wardrobe that spoke of quiet elegance. Her hair was styled in intricate locks, some threaded with silver, hinting at a wisdom beyond her years. Today she wore a tailored navy blue pantsuit, comfortable yet professional, a silent armor for the journey ahead. She was a leading researcher in cellular biology, a mind so bright that she was on the verge of a breakthrough in mitochondrial disease research. This trip from Boston to San Francisco was a celebration of that brilliance. She was the keynote speaker at the annual National Medical Innovators Conference, and the recipient of this year's coveted Copley Medal for her outstanding achievements. It was the culmination of a decade of relentless work, of sleepless nights in the lab, and of pushing through barriers both professional and deeply personal. The personal barrier was her constant, unwelcome companion, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS. It was an invisible illness, a treacherous ghost that haunted her connective tissues. Her joints were hypermobile and unstable, prone to subluxations and dislocations from the simplest movements. Her skin was soft but fragile, and beneath it all was the chronic, widespread pain. A low, static hum on good days, a roaring inferno on bad ones. Fatigue was another beast entirely, a leaden cloak that could descend without warning, stealing her energy and cognitive function. Today was a medium day. The pain was a 5 on her personal scale of 10, manageable with medication and careful movement, but the airport environment was a minefield of triggers. The long walks down terminals, the standing in lines, the sudden stops and starts of crowds, it all took a toll. That was why her husband, Julian, had insisted on booking her a first-class ticket on Ascend Air. "No arguments, Seffi," he had said that morning, his voice a warm, protective rumble as he adjusted the collar on her blouse. "You need the space, the comfort. You're going to accept an award, not run a marathon before you even get there." Serafina had smiled, leaning into his touch. Julian Croft was her rock, a self-made tech magnate who had recently diversified his portfolio by acquiring the struggling Ascend Air. He was a force of nature in the business world, decisive, sharp, and famously relentless. But with her, he was gentle, attentive, and fiercely protective. He understood her condition in a way few others did, having spent countless hours researching it, attending doctor's appointments, and simply holding her when the pain was too much. He saw the warrior beneath the weariness. He couldn't join her on this flight. A last-minute crisis with his European investors had him tethered to video calls. "I'll be there in spirit," he'd promised, kissing her forehead, "and I'll be watching the live stream of your speech from the boardroom. Knock 'em dead, Dr. Washington." At Boston Logan International Airport, Serafina navigated the bustling terminal with practiced deliberation. She used a sleek carbon fiber cane, not for constant support today, but as a preventative measure and a visual cue to others to give her a bit of space. She had her medical documentation, a detailed letter from her rheumatologist, Dr. Ann Sharma, tucked into her carry-on, a grim necessity for travel. She approached the Ascend Air first-class check-in counter. The agent was polite and efficient. She then made her way to the gate, B27, finding a seat near the boarding area. She knew the drill. She needed to pre-board. It wasn't about being first. It was about avoiding the crush of passengers, the jostling and bumping that could easily wrench her shoulder or hip out of place. It was about having a few quiet moments to get settled, to arrange her support cushions, and to breathe before the confinement of the flight. She watched the gate agents set up their podium. One was a young man with a kind face, Michael Chen, his name tag read. The other was an older woman, a senior flight attendant by her uniform's insignia, who was directing the setup with an air of brisk, no-nonsense authority. Her name tag identified her as Brenda O'Malley. She had tightly permed blonde hair, a face set in lines of permanent disapproval, and eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning for infractions. Serafina waited until they seemed settled, then approached the podium, her cane making a soft, rhythmic tap on the polished floor. "Excuse me," she began, addressing Michael, whose expression was more approachable. "I have a disability and will need to pre-board. I have my documentation right here if you need to see it." Michael smiled warmly. "Of course, ma'am. We'll be making the pre-boarding call for any passengers needing extra time or assistance in just a few minutes. I'll make sure to look for you." "Thank you. I appreciate that." As Serafina turned to go back to her seat, Brenda O'Malley's voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with suspicion. "What's the nature of your disability?" The question was abrupt, lacking the professional courtesy Michael had shown. Serafina turned back, her internal shields going up. This was a familiar, draining dance. "I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome," she said calmly. "It's a connective tissue disorder that affects my mobility and causes chronic pain." Brenda's eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of Serafina's body. They lingered on her expensive-looking carry-on bag, her well-tailored suit, and her composed demeanor. There was no visible cast, no wheelchair, no obvious sign of struggle. In Brenda's mind, the picture didn't match the request. "EDS," Brenda repeated flatly, as if the letters tasted sour. "Right. Well, as Michael said, we'll make the call. You'll have to be ready." The implication was clear. If you're truly disabled, you'd better look the part when we call you. Serafina felt a familiar flash of hot frustration, but pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. She simply nodded, gave a tight smile, and returned to her seat. She sat, closing her eyes for a moment, focusing on her breathing. She could already feel the stress causing her neck muscles to tighten, sending a fresh wave of pain radiating down her spine. The war was always there, and people like Brenda O'Malley were its unwitting, or perhaps very willing foot soldiers. The gate area was filling up now, a sea of faces, and Serafina felt a rising sense of unease. The journey had just begun, and it was already a battle. The minutes stretched on. The gate area became a cacophony of rolling suitcases, crying children, and announcements for other flights. Serafina watched the clock, her anxiety mounting. She saw Brenda O'Malley speaking into her walkie-talkie, her expression stern, occasionally glancing over in Serafina's direction. A knot of dread tightened in Serafina's stomach. This felt different from the usual casual ignorance. This felt personal. Finally, Michael Chen's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now ready to begin boarding flight 812 to San Francisco. At this time, we would like to invite our active-duty military personnel and any passengers requiring special assistance or extra time to board." This was her cue. Serafina stood, her joints protesting the movement, and picked up her carry-on and her cane. She made her way to the boarding lane where Michael stood ready to scan her ticket. As he did, Brenda stepped forward, physically placing a hand on the scanner to block it. "Just a moment," she said, her voice loud enough for several nearby passengers to turn their heads. She looked directly at Serafina, her eyes cold and accusatory. "I see you made it over here just fine without that cane," she remarked, nodding towards the carbon fiber stick in Serafina's hand. "You were sitting perfectly still for the last 20 minutes. Now suddenly you need to pre-board." The sheer audacity of the comment stunned Serafina into a moment of silence. The people in the zone 1-inch line behind her were now openly staring. The humiliation was a physical heat on her skin. My cane is for stability and to mitigate pain, not because I'm paralyzed, Serafina explained, her voice tight but even. She refused to be baited into a shouting match. And sitting still is precisely what causes stiffness and pain to set in. That's how this condition works. Brenda let out a short, incredulous laugh. Ma'am, I've been a flight attendant for 25 years. I've seen every trick in the book. People who want to get on early to snag overhead bin space. People who just want to feel important. You are holding up the entire boarding process. This is not a trick, Serafina said, her voice rising slightly despite her control. She opened her carry-on to retrieve the folder with her doctor's letter. I have a letter from my specialist at Massachusetts General Hospital. It explains everything. Brenda waved a dismissive hand. Oh, I'm sure you do. A letter. Anyone can get a letter these days. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. You think you can just waltz up here in your fancy suit and get whatever you want. But I know what you're doing. And it's frankly disgusting that you would take a spot from someone who is actually disabled. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It wasn't just an insult, it was an attack on her integrity, a denial of her daily lived reality of pain. Michael Chen, the younger gate agent, looked mortified. Brenda, maybe we should just look at the documentation. He started, trying to intervene. Stay out of this, Michael. Brenda snapped, not taking her eyes off Serafina. I'm the senior crew on this flight and I'm making the call. We have a manifest of passengers who pre-requested wheelchair assistance. This woman is not on it. She can board with her assigned zone. That's because I didn't request a wheelchair. I requested pre-boarding, which I am entitled to under the Air Carrier Access Act. Serafina countered, her knowledge as a doctor and a frequent flyer coming to the fore. Her heart was now hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of stress and anger. A woman in the Zone 1 line, dressed in a sharp business suit and holding a phone, watched the exchange with keen, intelligent eyes. She was an attorney named Cassandra Albright, and something about the flight attendant's attitude set off all her professional alarm bells. Without making it obvious, she angled her phone and began recording. Don't you quote regulations at me, young lady, Brenda retorted, her face flushing with anger. My discretion says you are fit to board with everyone else. Now please step aside. You're making a scene. She turned to Michael. Start scanning Zone 1. Defeated and trembling with a mixture of rage and shame, Serafina had no choice. She stepped back, her legs feeling unsteady. The walk of shame back to the waiting area felt a mile long. The stares of other passengers were like physical blows. She could hear them whispering. Did you see that? She was faking it. Some people have no shame. She was forced to wait as Zone 1 and Zone 2 boarded, a churning mass of bodies. By the time her first-class zone was called again, the jet bridge was crowded. As she tried to navigate the narrow passage, a man in a hurry jostled past her, bumping her shoulder hard. A sickeningly familiar sensation of grinding and slipping shot through her joint. She gasped, grabbing her shoulder as white-hot pain exploded from the point of impact. Her subluxated shoulder screamed in protest. Tears of pain and frustration pricked at her eyes, but she bit them back. She would not give Brenda the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Leaning heavily on her cane now, she finally made it onto the aircraft, her breath coming in ragged pants. She found her seat 2B, an aisle seat in the first-class cabin, and her heart sank. Standing there, arranging pillows in the galley, was Brenda O'Malley, who would be serving her cabin for the next 6 hours. Brenda saw her clutching her shoulder and her lips twisted into a smug, triumphant smile. It was a smile that said, I was right about you. You're just a performer. The long flight to San Francisco had just become a descent into a personal hell. The first hour of the flight was a study in exquisite torture. Serafina's shoulder throbbed with a deep, nauseating ache. She had managed to subtly pop it back into a more stable position, a grim skill acquired over years of such incidents. but the inflammation and resulting muscle spasms were setting in. Every slight jostle of the plane sent a fresh jolt of agony through her body. She fumbled in her bag for her emergency pain medication, her hands shaking so much it took 2 attempts to get the cap off. She swallowed the pills dry, praying they would kick in quickly. Brenda O'Malley seemed to take a perverse pleasure in Serafina's visible distress. While attending to other first-class passengers with saccharine sweetness, she treated Serafina with pointed neglect. Her offer of a pre-departure drink was skipped. When she took meal orders, she addressed the man in seat 2A and the couple across the aisle, completely ignoring Serafina as if her seat were empty. The man next to her, a kind-looking gentleman in his 50s, noticed. "Miss, the flight attendant seems to have missed you," he said gently. "It's all right," Serafina murmured, not wanting to cause another scene. "I'm not hungry." The pain had stolen her appetite anyway, but Brenda's cruelty was relentless and theatrical. When she came through the cabin collecting trash, she paused by Serafina's row. "Oh, are you needing something now?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "A pillow, perhaps? Or maybe you need me to help you pretend to be more comfortable." The comment was just low enough that only Serafina and her seatmate could hear it clearly. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. Serafina squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped her armrest. "I don't require anything, thank you," she said through clenched teeth. The breaking point came about 90 minutes into the flight. The medication was starting to dull the sharpest edges of her pain, but it also made her drowsy and slightly disoriented. The cabin lights were dimmed and she desperately needed to use the restroom. She knew this would be an ordeal. Standing up was the first challenge. She pushed herself up slowly, her whole body screaming in protest. The walk to the galley, only a few feet away, felt like crossing a continent. She had to brace herself on the backs of seats, her movements stiff and awkward. As she reached the front of the cabin, she found Brenda guarding the lavatory door, chatting with another flight attendant. "Excuse me," Serafina said, her voice barely a whisper. Brenda turned, her expression souring instantly. "The captain has the seatbelt sign on for anticipated turbulence. You need to return to your seat." Serafina glanced up. The sign was indeed on, though the air was perfectly smooth. It was often kept on by pilots for long stretches as a precaution. "It's an emergency," she pleaded softly. "I really must use the facilities." "An emergency," Brenda scoffed, making air quotes with her fingers. "Everything with you is an emergency, isn't it? First the pre-boarding, now this." She looked Serafina up and down again, a cruel smirk on her face. "You know, it's a miracle. You could barely walk a moment ago, but you made it all the way up here. It's amazing what a person can do when they really try." That was it. The final snap in a cord that had been stretched to its limit. The cumulative weight of the public shaming, the blatant discrimination, the denial of her pain, and the relentless, sadistic bullying crashed down on her. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The edges of her vision started to go dark. The stress, the pain, and the physiological strain were triggering a vasovagal response. Her blood pressure plummeted. I don't feel well," she stammered, reaching out a hand to steady herself against the bulkhead. "Oh, here we go," Brenda sighed dramatically. "The performance of a lifetime." But this was no performance. Serafina's legs gave way. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. She wasn't just collapsing, she was falling apart. She crumpled to the floor of the galley, her head narrowly missing the corner of a service cart. The last thing she saw before her vision went completely black was Brenda's face, a mask of irritation momentarily flashing with shock. A gasp went through the front of the cabin. Her seatmate was instantly on his feet. "My God," she collapsed. "Is there a doctor on board?" he yelled. From a few rows back, Cassandra Albright, the lawyer who had been recording at the gate, was already unbuckling her seatbelt. Brenda, finally jolted out of her venomous trance and into a state of panic, knelt down. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her voice was shrill with fear. The situation had spiraled far beyond her control. Serafina was unconscious for only a few seconds. She came to, disoriented on the cold galley floor. The other flight attendant was trying to elevate her feet. Passengers were craning their necks. The illusion of a calm, orderly flight was shattered. Pain, raw and unfiltered, was everywhere. Her shoulder was on fire, her head ached. But through the fog of pain, a cold, diamond-hard clarity emerged. She was done being a victim. She was done being quiet. With trembling fingers, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer where she always kept her phone. Her hands were shaking too badly to dial, so she used the voice command, her voice weak but clear. "Call Julian." The phone rang. On the other end, in a high-tech boardroom in Boston, Julian Croft was in the middle of a tense negotiation. He had instructed his assistant to hold all calls, but his phone had a special setting. A call from My Cephii would bypass every silent mode, every do not disturb, every firewall. It was the one call he would always take. He excused himself, stepping into his private office overlooking the city. "Cephii, is everything okay, my love? I thought you'd be in the air." Serafina took a shaky breath, the sounds of the concerned cabin buzzing around her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her voice was chillingly calm. "Julian," she said, "I'm on the plane, and it's happening again, but it's worse this time." A pause. "It's on your airline, Julian. It's on Ascend Air." In his Boston office, Julian Croft's world tilted on its axis. The background noise on the call, the concerned murmurs, the professional tone of a flight attendant asking for a doctor, painted a terrifying picture. But it was the cold, quiet control in his wife's voice that chilled him to the bone. That was her voice for when the pain was unbearable, for when she was holding herself together by a thread. "It's happening again on your airline." The blood drained from his face, replaced by a glacial fury. "Cephii, talk to me. What happened? Where are you hurt?" "My shoulder. At the gate. The flight attendant," she managed to get out, her breath hitching. "She said I was faking, refused pre-boarding. I collapsed in the galley." Every word was a hammer blow. He could picture it all. The humiliation, the pain, the utter helplessness. And it had happened under his own roof, on the airline he had bought with promises of a new, compassionate corporate culture. The irony was a scalding fire in his gut. "All right, my love. All right, just breathe. I'm handling it," he said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "What's the flight number?" 812, she whispered. "I have it. Don't you worry about another thing. I'm going to take care of it. I love you." "I love you," she replied, her voice trembling as she disconnected the call. Julian stood motionless for a single second, his mind a supercomputer processing an attack. Then he moved. He strode back into the boardroom, where his executive team and the European investors were waiting. "Amelia," he said, his voice sharp as cut glass, addressed to his chief operating officer, Amelia Vance. "The meeting is over. There's a code red event on flight 812 from Boston to San Francisco. My wife is on board and has been medically compromised due to a direct action by the flight crew." The room fell silent. Amelia, a woman accustomed to Julian's intensity, had never seen this look in his eyes. It was a look that promised utter devastation. "Get me the head of our SFO ground operations, the station manager, and a paramedic team on a conference call. Now," he commanded. "Scramble the executive jet. I'm flying to San Francisco. And get me Captain Stevenson, the pilot on flight 812, patched through to the cockpit immediately. Use the emergency satellite link." While Amelia and her team sprang into action, a whirlwind of calls and commands, Julian got on the line with the flight deck. On board flight 812, Captain Robert Stevenson was dealing with a pilot's nightmare. A passenger had collapsed, the senior flight attendant was in hysterics, and the cabin was in disarray. He had just authorized a request for paramedics to meet the plane upon landing, when his co-pilot informed him of an urgent, non-negotiable satellite call from the CEO's office. "This is Captain Stevenson," he answered, annoyed at the intrusion. "Captain, this is Julian Croft." The voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made the hairs on Stevenson's arms stand up. "I'm the owner of this airline. I'm told my wife, Dr. Serafina Washington, has had a medical incident on your flight. I want a status report, now." Stevenson's blood ran cold. Dr. Serafina Washington. He looked at the passenger manifest on his screen. Seat 2B. The passenger his senior attendant, Brenda, had dismissed and belittled. He had backed her judgment. He had kept the seatbelt sign on. He was complicit. "Mr. Croft, sir," he stammered. "Yes, a passenger, your wife, collapsed in the galley. We are attending to her. A doctor on board has seen her and she is now stable and back in her seat. We have requested paramedics to meet us at the gate." "You will not go to the gate," Julian commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will be redirected to a private hangar on the airfield. My ground team will give you the coordinates. You will tell no one the reason. You will land this plane and you will wait for me to board. Is that understood?" Yes, sir. Understood." Back in the cabin, an uneasy peace had settled. Dr. Mark Chen, a cardiologist from UCSF who happened to be on board, and no relation to the gate agent, had examined Serafina. He confirmed her shoulder subluxation, noted her elevated heart rate and low blood pressure, and made her as comfortable as possible. He had given Brenda a dressing down so severe and professionally quiet that she had shrunk back to the galley, pale and shaking. Cassandra Albright, the lawyer, had discreetly stopped recording but had saved the video and made a backup. She gave Serafina her business card. "I saw what happened at the gate," she said softly. "I have it on video. If you need a witness or anything else, you call me. What they did was illegal and unconscionable." Serafina took the card with a grateful nod, the small piece of paper feeling like a weapon. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the passengers noticed they weren't following the usual approach. Instead of joining a line of planes, they were vectored away to a remote part of the airport. When they landed, they didn't taxi to the terminal. They rolled towards a large private hangar, where 2 black executive cars and an ambulance sat waiting, lights flashing silently. The cabin buzzed with confusion. Captain Stevenson's voice came over the PA, strained and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a minor medical issue and for the privacy of the passenger involved, we will be deplaning from this location. Please remain seated until the passenger and her party have disembarked." The engines spooled down. The jet bridge didn't come. Instead, a set of air stairs rolled up to the forward door. The door opened. Brenda O'Malley, standing in the galley, composed herself, ready to assist with the deplaning. She expected paramedics. She did not expect the man who came up the stairs. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face a mask of controlled fury. He exuded a power that seemed to suck the air out of the cabin. He walked past Brenda as if she were a piece of furniture and went straight to Captain Stevenson, who had emerged from the cockpit. "Captain," the man said, his voice low and resonant. "I'm Julian Croft." Brenda's heart stopped. Croft, as in the name of the new billionaire owner who had been in all the company-wide emails. Her mind reeled. It couldn't be. Julian then turned his attention to Serafina, who was being helped to her feet by Dr. Chen. His entire demeanor softened instantly. He knelt before her, taking her hand gently. "Safi, I'm here." He then looked up, his gaze sweeping over the flight crew. It landed on Brenda. Serafina, seeing the look on her husband's face, simply said, "Her, Julian, the flight attendant. Her name is Brenda." Julian stood up slowly, his eyes locking with Brenda's. The smugness, the cruelty, the petty tyranny she had wielded for hours. It all evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried through the silent cabin like a death knell. "Brenda O'Malley," he began, letting her name hang in the air. "I'm Julian Croft. I own Ascend Air. I sign the checks that pay for your uniform, your training, and your salary. And you dared to lay hands on my wife? You dared to call her a liar." Brenda O'Malley's face went chalk white. The color drained away, leaving a pasty, terrified mask. A small, strangled sound escaped her lips. The world as she knew it had just ended, right here on the floor of her first-class galley. Karma had not just knocked on her door. It had kicked it off its hinges and was coming for everything she had. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute, broken only by the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power. Every passenger, every crew member was frozen, witness to a corporate execution. Brenda O'Malley stood as if turned to stone, her face a canvas of pure terror. Julian Croft did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His fury was a palpable force, a low-frequency hum of absolute power. "Captain Stevenson," he said, turning to the pilot, who looked as if he was about to be physically ill. "You will escort Miss O'Malley off this aircraft. Her credentials and access cards are to be surrendered to my head of security, who is waiting at the bottom of these stairs. She is not to touch any personal belongings. She is suspended, effective immediately, pending an investigation that I will personally oversee." He then turned his gaze back to Brenda. "You will be contacted by our legal department. I suggest you find a lawyer. You are going to need one." Two large men in dark suits, part of Julian's security detail, ascended the stairs. Without a word, they flanked Brenda, their presence brooking no argument. She was paralyzed, unable to speak or move until one of them gently touched her arm. The touch broke her trance, and a pathetic whimper escaped her lips as they guided her down the stairs, out of the aircraft and out of the career she had built over a quarter of a century. Julian's attention immediately returned to Serafina. The paramedics came aboard, and with the gentle assistance of Dr. Chen, they assessed her, confirming the signs of a severe vasovagal episode and the acute injury to her shoulder. They carefully helped her into a transport chair. As she was wheeled towards the door, Julian paused and addressed the bewildered passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, my deepest apologies for this disruption. My name is Julian Croft. What you witnessed today was an unforgivable failure of our airline to protect a passenger. A failure of basic human decency. Every single one of you will be fully refunded for this flight and will receive a voucher for a future first-class trip. Furthermore, a significant donation will be made in all of your names to the Ehlers-Danlos Society. Thank you for your patience." He then turned to Cassandra Albright, the lawyer, who was watching him intently. He had noticed the business card in his wife's hand. "And you, ma'am. My wife indicated you were a witness." "I was," Cassandra said, her voice steady. "I have a video of the initial confrontation at the gate in Boston." A grim smile touched Julian's lips. "I will be in touch." The next 48 hours were a blur of coordinated, ruthless action. Serafina was taken to a top orthopedic specialist in San Francisco. The diagnosis was a significant subluxation with minor tearing of the labrum, exacerbated by the stress-induced collapse. Her recovery would be long and painful. For Ascendair, the storm had just begun. Julian didn't just want to fire Brenda O'Malley. He wanted to eradicate the culture that created and protected her. He didn't just use his own internal teams. He hired the most feared independent corporate investigation firm in the country, a group of former federal prosecutors known for their scorched earth tactics. The investigation, led by a formidable woman named Iris Chang, started with Brenda. Her life began to unravel with terrifying speed. She was, as promised, fired for gross misconduct. The Flight Attendants Union, initially prepared to defend a 25-year veteran, backed away the moment they were shown Cassandra Albright's crystal-clear video of the gate incident. They saw the public relations nightmare and cut her loose. But that was only the beginning of the karma. The investigators dug into Brenda's employment file. They found a disturbing pattern. Over the past decade, more than a dozen complaints had been filed against her by passengers, many mentioning rudeness, discrimination, and a specific hostility towards passengers with disabilities. They had all been quietly dismissed by a mid-level HR manager named Gerald Finney, a man who believed his primary job was to make problems go away, to protect the company from lawsuits. He and Brenda were old friends. Gerald was summoned to a meeting with Iris Chang and Ascendair's general counsel. He walked in with his usual blustering confidence. He walked out 30 minutes later, jobless, with the company reserving the right to pursue legal action against him for dereliction of duty and suppression of formal complaints. Captain Stevenson was suspended for 2 months without pay and was required to complete a rigorous and humbling disability sensitivity and leadership course. His spotless record was permanently marred by a formal reprimand for his failure to intervene and protect a passenger. His authority had been tested, and he had failed. The video, which Cassandra Albright provided to Julian's team, was strategically leaked to a major news network. The story exploded. Ascendair crew humiliates disabled scientist, wife of Airline's own CEO. The headlines were a corporate catastrophe. The stock price dipped. Social media was a firestorm of outrage. People shared their own horror stories of traveling with disabilities. Brenda O'Malley became the face of that outrage. Her name and image were everywhere. She was doxxed. She received threats. She had to delete her social media, unplug her phone, and stay with her sister in another state. When she tried to find another job in the airline industry, she was radioactive. No carrier would touch her. The 25 years of seniority, the pension she was close to vesting, the travel benefits, it all vanished. The hard karma, however, came from an unexpected direction. One of the old complaints the investigators had unearthed was from a man whose elderly father, a stroke survivor with limited mobility, had been treated cruelly by Brenda 5 years prior. The incident had exacerbated his father's condition, and he had passed away 6 months later. At the time, the man's complaint had been dismissed by Gerald Finney. Now, armed with the public story, the video evidence of a clear pattern of behavior, and a law firm working pro bono, the man filed a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against both Ascendair and Brenda O'Malley personally for wrongful death and emotional distress. Brenda's world had not just been shaken, it had been systematically dismantled and burned to the ground. She was left with nothing but legal bills, public shame, and the bitter, echoing memory of her own words, "I know what you're doing." She had accused a woman of faking a disability, never imagining that the consequence would be the very real, very public, and very permanent disability of her own life and career. The news cycle, with its voracious and fleeting appetite, eventually moved on. The story of the CEO's wife and the cruel flight attendant faded from the headlines, replaced by the next wave of outrage and celebrity. But for the 3 people at the heart of the storm, Serafina, Julian, and Brenda, the true consequences had only just begun to unfold. The public scandal was merely the lightning flash. The long, rolling thunder of its aftermath would reshape their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. It was in the quiet months that followed that the real story was written. A story of painful alchemy, corporate atonement, and the chilling solitude of unexamined bitterness. For Dr. Serafina Washington, healing was not a straight line but a jagged, arduous climb. The physical recovery from her injuries was a frustrating daily battle fought on the sterile floor of a physical therapy clinic. Her therapist, a kind but firm woman named Maria, would guide her through microscopic movements designed to strengthen the supporting muscles around her hypermobile shoulder. Each session was a fresh reminder of her body's fragility and the public violence of the incident. There were days she wanted to scream, as a simple rotation sent a familiar, sickening jolt of pain through her joint. "Easy, Dr. Washington," Maria would say, her hand steady. "This is not a race. This is about rebuilding the foundation one brick at a time." But the deeper wounds were not in her ligaments. They were in her spirit. For weeks she was haunted by a newfound agoraphobia, a fear of crowds and the judgment of strangers. A simple trip to the grocery store could trigger a panic attack, the casual glances of other shoppers feeling like the accusatory stares she had endured at the gate. The thought of getting on another plane, even one of Julian's, filled her with a dread so profound it left her breathless. It was Julian who found her one evening, curled up in a window seat staring out at the sky with tears silently streaming down her face. He didn't speak, simply sat beside her, his presence a warm, solid anchor. "I don't know if I can do it, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. "The interview, going public. I'm a scientist. I live behind a microscope. They'll just see a rich woman complaining." Julian took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "No, Seffi," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "They will see a brilliant woman who was wronged. They will see someone who can speak for everyone who doesn't have a voice. Your pain, what that woman put you through, it was horrific. But your voice, my love, your voice is a weapon. You're a scientist. You see a problem and you find a solution. The problem isn't just one ignorant flight attendant. It's the whole system. You can help fix it." His words struck a chord deep within her. He wasn't asking her to be a victim. He was asking her to be what she had always been, a problem solver. The scientist in her began to stir. This was not just a personal trauma. It was a data point in a massive, flawed system. Her experience could be the catalyst for a paradigm shift. That night they began to work. Spread across their large dining room table were not dinner plates, but legal pads, market research on disability advocacy, and drafts of a mission statement. This was the birth of the Serafina Foundation. Julian brought his business acumen, his understanding of logistics and funding. But Serafina brought its soul. She meticulously mapped out its purpose, not just advocacy, but tangible support. They would fund research into the often misunderstood mechanisms of connective tissue disorders. They would provide grants for assistive technologies. They would create educational programs designed for medical schools and corporations, using her scientific credibility to dismantle ignorance at its source. When she finally sat down for the televised interview, she was no longer a victim. She was a general. She spoke with a calm, irrefutable authority, translating her personal ordeal into a universal call to action. She explained the science of her invisible illness with the clarity of a seasoned lecturer, then described the emotional reality with a vulnerability that was utterly captivating. The cruelty of one person was a symptom of a much larger disease, she stated, her gaze steady and clear. A disease of ignorance and disbelief. My story is not unique because of what happened to me. It's unique because of who my husband is. But justice shouldn't depend on who you're married to. It should be a fundamental right, as accessible as the air we breathe. While Serafina was transforming her pain into purpose, Julian Croft was waging a war inside his own company. His initial white-hot rage had cooled into something far more dangerous, a cold, methodical obsession. He'd made his fortune in tech by disrupting established systems, and he now turned that same relentless energy on the ossified culture of Ascend Air. He sat in the main boardroom, a vast space of glass and steel, listening to Iris Chang, the lead investigator, deliver her final report. The numbers were damning. Over 5 years, disability-related complaints at Ascend Air were 300% more likely to be dismissed without action than any other category of complaint. Crew members who completed the bare minimum online accessibility training module had an 80% pass rate on the first try, because the answers were painfully obvious and required no real comprehension. The system wasn't just broken. It was designed to create people like Brenda O'Malley and managers like Gerald Finney. When a long-serving board member, a man named Marcus Thorne, audibly scoffed at the projected $50 million cost of the Ascent Initiative, Julian slowly turned his eyes on him. "You have a problem with this, Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice deceptively mild. $50 million is a significant expenditure on sensitivity training, Julian, Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. Our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders. Our primary asset isn't our planes, Marcus. It's our reputation. It's the trust of the public, Julian retorted, leaning forward. And right now, that asset is in critical condition. We sold a product, safe and respectful travel, and we failed to deliver in the most spectacular way imaginable. This isn't an expenditure. It's a transfusion. We will become the single most trusted airline for every traveler, especially those who have been let down by our entire industry. We will monetize decency. This initiative will pay for itself tenfold. Any other questions? The boardroom was silent. The war was won. The rollout of the Ascent Initiative was Julian's masterpiece of corporate re-engineering. The empathy-based training was mandatory and in person. One module, which became legendary within the company, involved a high-fidelity simulator. Veteran flight attendants were put in motion-restricting braces that mimicked severe arthritis, wore headphones that created the disorienting auditory sensitivity of autism, and were given glasses that simulated the visual disturbances of a migraine. They were then tasked with navigating a crowded, chaotic airport environment. Tough, cynical crew members emerged from the 30-minute simulation pale and shaken, some wiping away tears. For the first time, they understood. The accessibility concierge service became a lifeline for travelers. A mother of a non-verbal child with sensory processing disorder called in tears, terrified of an upcoming flight. The concierge worked with her for a week, creating a social story with pictures of the actual plane and crew, arranging for a quiet boarding process, and ensuring the in-flight entertainment system was preloaded with the child's favorite calming videos. The flight was a success, and the mother's effusive, grateful email was read aloud by Julian at the next all-hands meeting. This was the new Ascend Air. For Brenda O'Malley, there was no ascent. There was only the fall, followed by a long, slow slide into a state of permanent twilight. Her life, once defined by the crisp authority of her uniform and the contained world of the aircraft, now took place under the flickering fluorescent lights of a price-right superstore. Her new uniform was a cheap, ill-fitting polyester smock, perpetually smelling faintly of warehouse dust and floor cleaner. The lawsuit had decimated her finances, forcing her to sell her small condominium. She now lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the rhythmic thumping of the machines a constant mocking soundtrack to her evenings. But the true hell was not her financial ruin. It was the prison of her own mind. In her version of events, she was the victim. She had been made an example of by a vindictive billionaire and his overly sensitive wife. She would sit in her threadbare armchair, nursing a glass of cheap Chardonnay, and replay the incident not with remorse, but with burning resentment. Fancy suit, that stick she barely used, she'd mutter to the empty room. She was asking for it. I was just doing my job. She never once considered the terror Serafina must have felt, or the deep cellular reality of her pain. To do so would be to admit her own monstrous error, and her pride, the last thing she had left, would not allow it. She was marooned on the island of her own righteousness. The deepest cut came on a Tuesday evening. The store was quiet. Brenda was on autopilot, her hands mechanically sliding items over the scanner. Two women in her line were chatting animatedly. "I'm telling you, Diane, it was amazing," the first woman said. "My mother has severe fibromyalgia, and flying has always been a nightmare. But we flew Ascend. They have this new concierge thing. They met her with a pre-warmed neck pillow, had her seat all set up. The crew kept checking on her. It was the first time she's flown without a flare-up in years. It's all because of that foundation, the one that poor woman started." Brenda's hand froze over a carton of eggs. Her heart began to pound a sickening, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She kept her head down, her bangs hiding her eyes. At that exact moment, she glanced up at the small television mounted above the aisle. A local news segment was on, highlighting a recent charity gala. And there she was, Dr. Serafina Washington, looking elegant and powerful, accepting a civic leadership award on behalf of the Serafina Foundation. "Our goal," Serafina's voice filled the quiet store, "is to ensure that no one ever has to prove their pain to be shown compassion." Brenda's breath caught in her throat. The woman on the screen was not merely healed, she was transformed. She had taken the ugliest moment of her life, a moment Brenda had single-handedly created, and had spun it into a legacy of compassion and change. She had built a kingdom from the rubble of her humiliation. Brenda finished ringing up the order, her hands trembling. The customer took her receipt. "Have a nice night," the woman said cheerfully. Brenda couldn't answer. She just stood there, a ghost at the feast of a new, better world she had inadvertently helped to create. Her karma wasn't the lawsuit or the loss of her job. It was this moment. It was the crushing, absolute, and undeniable weight of her own irrelevance. She had tried to make one woman small, and had, in the process, rendered herself completely and utterly insignificant. While Serafina Washington was ascending, Brenda O'Malley was simply and silently erased. The story of Dr. Serafina Washington and Ascend Air is a stark reminder that our actions, especially towards the vulnerable, have consequences that can ripple out in ways we can never predict. It's a story of how one woman's resilience in the face of abject humiliation brought an entire corporation to its knees and then raised it back up, better than before. But it asks us a question. Why did it take the victim being married to the CEO for justice to be served? What happens to the thousands of others who face this kind of discrimination every single day without that power? What would you have done if you were a passenger on that flight? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a like, share it with your friends so this message can be heard, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama that will make you think. Thank you for listening.